Welcome. Thank you for joining us for the webinar. We're glad that you're here. Thank you and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, No Politicking, Protecting the Johnson Amendment. We're glad that you joined us for today's important conversation on this topic. So on behalf of Americans United, I would like to introduce myself. I am Sabrina Dent. I serve as the Senior Faith Advisor for Americans United for the separation of church and state. Just to give you a little background information, Americans United is a nonpartisan educational and advocacy organization dedicated to advancing the separation of religion and government as the only way to ensure the freedom of religion, including the right to believe or not to believe for all people. At AU, we believe that religion should not dictate public policy and discrimination is not justified under the guise of religion. Today's program, No Politicking, Protecting the Johnson Amendment, features an incredible roster of panelists and experts that will engage us in this discussion as we move through this now election season and learn some of the do's and do nots of what happens in houses of worship around this time of the year. So I would like to first introduce our panelists for the afternoon. We have Maggie Garrett, who is the VP of Public Policy here at Americans United. Also, we're joined by Judge Wendell Griffin, who is the pastor of New Millennium Church, but he's also an Arkansas Sixth Circuit judge in Arkansas. We are also joined by Rabbi Robert Barr, who is the founder of Congregation Beth Adam. And our moderator for this afternoon is Suha Sukla, who is the executive director and the co-founder of the Hindu American Foundation. I will introduce our moderator shortly, but I want to invite you to share with others this discussion that is happening today on social media. We are streaming on Facebook Live, so thank you for those of you who are joining us via Facebook and Zoom. I also encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A bar. There will be lots of opportunities for you to engage the panelists via your questions, so please do so, and then also the chat feature is available if you just want to share commentary. So with that, I would like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon, Suha Sukla. She is the executive director and the co-founder of the Hindu American Foundation. She holds a BA in religion and a JD from the University of Florida. Suhag has helped steer the foundation to be recognized as a leading voice for civil rights, human rights, and religious freedom. She has served on the boards of the Nirvana Center, Mainline Indian Association, the YWCA of Minneapolis, as well as the YWCA of Minneapolis. She is also a member of the Department of Homeland Security, Faith-Based Security and Communications Subcommittee. At the same time, she is very active in her community, as well as being a part of the Interfaith Center of Greater Philadelphia's Paths to Understanding Public Art Initiative. You will get to hear more from Suhag during the discussion that will take place today. So again, I encourage you to listen, to ask questions, and bring your healthy sense of curiosity as we learn more about why we need to continue to protect the Johnson Amendment. So with that, I turn the program over to Suhag.
Thank you, Sabrina, and thank you, Americans United, for hosting this very important conversation. I don't think we have any choice but to realize we are in the end weeks of our current election cycle, and whether you're on YouTube, you're going to see the ads. Whether you're on TV, you're going to see the ads. So there's no escaping it. I thought maybe we could start with just kind of a quick round robin in talking about what brings us to this conversation, why or where, what is our stance on the separation of church and state. So I'll just quickly kick off our conversation to say that it was probably when I first started the unit on constitutional law and the separation of church and state and First Amendment that I was hooked. And from law school onwards, just always keenly interested in this intersection of church and state and the promise that our Constitution makes, and where we as a country have lived up to that promise and where we've fallen short. The Hindu American Foundation is the advocacy organization for which I serve as the executive director, but was also a co-founder. And it was in our very early days that a friendship with the Americans United for Separation of Church and State began in the case of Van Orden versus Perry. And we've had a robust working relationship for the past 17 years on issues ranging from the public display of the Ten Commandments to school prayer, to legislative prayer, to same-sex marriage, and a number of other critical issues that have tested the boundaries of church and state. Let's hear from you, Rabbi Barr, next. If you could just unmute yourself.
Thank you, Suhad, for reminding me of that. And thank you for Americans United for inviting me for this, to participate in this really important topic. For me, separation of church and state is a core American value. I think it is incredibly important as a religious minority. It is for the Jewish community extremely important. It is the first country in the world that allowed us to be equals. We weren't guests here, we were full and equal citizens. So the defense of the separation of church and state has been a part of my personal experience and the Jewish community's experience for quite some time. I have served as the vice president of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Cincinnati about 30 years ago, and my portfolio was separation of church and state. And we recognize how important it is to ensure that everyone feels included, not marginalized. That is for religious minorities, for people who don't hold traditional beliefs. So it is something I have been deeply engaged in. And recently my Congregation Beth Adam in Loveland, Ohio, took separation of church and state as one of its social justice initiatives. We've seen the erosion of the separation of church and state over the last many years now, and it's getting more and more frightening. And for many of us, we see ourselves being pushed to the margins, and we need to stop it at every opportunity. As somebody who has preached from the pulpit for 40 years, there have been times that I have wanted to scream at the top of my lungs who I was for, but I recognize that violating that amendment and violating that separation of church and state would do more harm than good. So I'm delighted to be participating and talking about why it's so important today.
Thank you, Rabbi Barr. Judge Griffin, if we could hear your thoughts on what your personal experience has been with the separation of church and state and where you stand.
Thank you very much. And it's a joy to be with each of you. And I want to add my thanks to Americans United for convening this webinar. I grew up in Arkansas and have grown up in the so-called Bible Belt, where the notion of faith life is almost as thick as the humidity is in our southern air. And I have grown up in the faith of my ancestors, and also grew up during the 60s, during the time when people of faith, Dr. King and other people of faith, were making the issue of civil rights to include civil freedoms a very big issue. It was not until I got into law school that I was able to make the next move from civil rights in the race context to the issue of separation of church and state. And as you mentioned, Suhag, the constitutional law was the window. And as a pastor, I have had to walk, as Rabbi Barr mentioned, the tension between the prophetic that I have as a pastor and the partisan, because we are in the partisan season and we live in a very partisan culture. How do I, as a prophetic pastor, avoid being sucked into the partisan vortex so that the faith is corrupted, but also the body politic is corrupted? And so I have, as a result of my pastoral and my legal experience, had to wrestle with that. And as a judge, of course, these issues come up more often than one thinks.
Thank you, Judge Griffin. And Maggie, I think maybe your job title gives us some insight into where you might stand on this issue. But
Exactly. At Americans United, we believe in the separation of church and state. But I tell everyone, because it's a true story, that I learned about church-state separation from my Lutheran pastor and my Republican father. When I was a kid, I was really too young sort of to understand it fully, but our pastor came to the church, and one of the first things he did was he took the American flag out of the sanctuary and put it right outside of the sanctuary, talking about the separation of church and state and those sorts of issues, and the importance of keeping your worship pure in that way. And so I sort of, that was sort of an early memory of mine. And then sort of growing up, I just really believe that it's one of the core constitutional principles, because without church-state separation, you can't have real religious freedom. You can't have really the ability to have your own beliefs if the government is telling you that you can get favors if you actually adhere to a different belief or if you change those things around. So I think it's a core value. And then when I went to law school, I thought I was going to do environmental law, and then I realized that I'm both really bad at science and I don't enjoy regulatory law. And so I took some church-state separation courses, and I was like, I want to do this for forever. And I actually got really lucky. My first job out of law school was the first fellowship in the legal department at AU. And so I've been working on these issues for 20 years now.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Maggie. So I have a constitutional lawyer, a judge who's a pastor, and a rabbi with me today for our conversation. So my one request is going to be that we all try to be as concise and as thorough as possible so that we can also get to the questions from the audience. I have some prepared for our conversation to begin with. So with that, before we jump into talking about the Johnson Amendment and some of the different perspectives that our panelists bring to the issue and to the law, Maggie, maybe you can start us off with kind of an overview. When was the Johnson Amendment introduced? What's the backstory? Is there any current legislation or a general push that seeks to change the Johnson Amendment?
Sure. So the Johnson Amendment is a more than 60-year-old provision in the tax code that prohibits all nonprofit organizations, this includes charitable nonprofits, houses of worship, and foundations, from endorsing or opposing political parties or candidates for public office. It applies equally to secular and to religious nonprofits. To be clear, nonprofits and houses of worship can speak out on political, social, or moral issues. They just can't endorse or oppose candidates. The law is called the Johnson Amendment because then Senator Lyndon B. Johnson offered the language to a bill, but the restrictions that prohibited endorsements actually existed way before Johnson. There was at least a decade of tax court laws that had said, or court decisions, that had said that nonprofit organizations couldn't endorse or oppose candidates. And there are a couple of important reasons for doing so. The tax exempt status is really a government subsidy, And so here the government has decided to subsidize nonprofits to promote work that serves the public good. Allowing people to take a tax deduction for donating promotes giving. Giving tax exemptions to the organization itself allows the money to go further, and tax exempt status enhances the charitable work overall. So charitable organizations on the right and the left get the subsidy, but taxpayers don't want to subsidize partisan activity, and the Johnson Amendment ensures that they won't have to. And really, it's a protection for houses of worship. So it protects them from partisan politics, and no one wants our houses of worship to be tools of candidates. So for all of those reasons, the Johnson Amendment is really important, and really it hadn't been controversial for a really long time, but over the last few years, it's been targeted for repeal. So there are certain religious leaders who are looking for political power, and there are certain political leaders who want to use houses of worship for their own political gain. And they have been pushing to repeal the Johnson Amendment, or sometimes it's often really a push to just exempt houses of worship from the Johnson Amendment. The fight over the Johnson Amendment was at its peak just a few years ago when Congress was working on a tax reform bill, and we fought incredibly hard to keep it out of the 2018 tax reform bill, and it actually came down to the very last night before the final bill was on the floor. And I tell people the story that I was in line to watch the Star Wars. It was like the opening night of a Star Wars movie, and I was listening to my C-SPAN app and texting people, and I was like, I just out-nerded the entire line of Star Wars opening night people with my my Johnson Amendment love. But anyway, so there are attempts. We won the last one. There are continuing attempts, and that we'll just keep fighting.
I remember that fight, and Americans United really led the way on that. So thank you again for all that you did. And it did get to the wire. So let me ask, this next question is for both Judge Griffin and Rabbi Barr, probably in that order. But what's the importance of the Johnson Amendment to you as a faith leader? Judge Griffin?
Let me explain it this way. As a faith leader, I have a responsibility for leading a congregation according to the precepts of our faith, which is not set by government. The government doesn't set it, nor does any political party set it. And my ability to do that is hindered if I am going to constantly have to referee various politicians coming in saying, I want to talk about this, and I want you to endorse that. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, we're in the silly season where every politician wants to come in. And so our ability to do our business as people of faith is really hindered when we have to wrestle with that. Now that's the down and dirty truth of it.
Rabbi Barr?
I agree, I absolutely agree with Judge Griffin, and would add to that, I want my members to see me as someone they can turn to, whether they're on the right or the left side of the aisle. I am their religious leader, and I want them to have confidence in me that what I'm saying comes out of our values and articulates them clearly. Moreover, I think it can be incredibly detrimental to congregations if people see the congregation as a place that can become overtly political, where someone would come to me and say, I'm going to donate money only if you do X, Y, or Z. I think it could really upset the balance. And if the Johnson Amendment would be repealed, it would become an avenue for really a new form of dark money, if you will, because we don't have to reveal our donors. And it could change the whole nature of what the congregation is about. And one would oftentimes have to question whether my words come from my place of belief, or as it comes out of my place of partisanship and donations. And I think that's why it is so important to keep it clear, separate, neat, and clean.
Okay, thank you. So, I want to explore a little bit more about what this looks like in the synagogue, in the church, in the temple. Some people see it as a thick line, Perhaps in other congregations, it might be a fine line. For others, it's a big gray area. And that's kind of the difference between advocacy and political activity, which isn't the same as endorsing a political candidate, but it certainly can be. And there are these limitations on that. So I'd like to hear from both of you, Rabbi Barr, as well as Judge Griffin, as leaders of faith. How do you ensure the well-being of your congregation in terms of laws that might impact them, and doing that without kind of crossing any lines, whether it's, you know, if there is a particular candidate that's policies or their platform is more supportive towards something that's going to maybe impact a good majority of your congregation?
So for me, it comes from a place of philosophy and principles, values, and ideals. I think we need to articulate those as religious leaders clearly, effectively, and we need to urge our members then to take those and act on them. I think that that's the great quality of religion, that people take what they believe and then act. So our responsibility is to be able to articulate what those values are. Now, there are occasions, and it's happened in Ohio, where they're trying to change some of the rules around religion and how it intersects with schools. And my responsibility is to make sure that the children that I'm responsible for, the Jewish children, if you will, don't feel marginalized. And then we have a responsibility to talk about that with political leaders about how do you create an inclusive society that everyone feels valued and everyone feels empowered. So it's knowing what we believe and then acting on those beliefs and articulating it both to our members and then articulating it to those with whom we may disagree, hoping to get them to see why their actions may be harmful and hurtful to young children. I remember my own kids when they were growing up and they were little kids, and they would come to me and say, why are they doing it? And at the time, it was a lot of stuff around Christmas in the school, and the kids didn't feel like they were being acknowledged that they were Jewish, and they felt less than. And I think there's a responsibility we have to make sure in America that no one feels less than anyone else. And separation of church and state is part of the principle that does that.
Thank you, Rabbi Barr. Judge Griffin.
I have, for several years now, insisted that our congregation know and share with other people in the community, because politicians contact people in congregations that we want to come to the church and want to say something during the service about our campaign. And so I've told our congregation, number one, everyone in the world is welcome in our congregation anytime. But this is a faith community. I do not go to the legislature and hold worship services. And you don't come to this congregation and hold a political rally. I'll stay in my lane and you stay in your lane. You're welcome to come here and worship, but you're not welcome to come here and politic. And I promise you, if you come here and worship, you can have a hallelujah good time. But if you come here politicking, the ushers and I will see you out. And the congregation knows that I'm crazy enough to follow up with that. And I've told politicians that. They say, you want to come? I said, yeah, come, welcome, come worship. Can I talk? No. You can say amen. You can say hallelujah. You can say hello. You can pass the peace, but you cannot engage in your political activity. And the word gets out.
It sure does. So Maggie, you know, in my experience with the Hindu American community, you know, it's we're a religious minority community and also largely an immigrant community. So you have a lot of new citizens who aren't always familiar with the law. And so there's a lot of fear around inviting local candidates or local politicians, but in some way that also then leaves them off the kind of proverbial table because they're not making those connections. So what would you say in terms of what is allowed and what's not allowed, so that it provides clarity for those communities who may not be familiar with the Johnson Amendment and overall general restrictions on 501c3s.
So you can do a lot of political work, right? Like we're a 501c3 and I go up to the Hill every day and work on issues. I work with you all. I work with the Religious Action Center, the Baptist Joint Committee. They're all 501c3s. And we talk about politics all the time. You can talk about politics from the pulpit. You could say, you know, you support marriage between same-sex couples, or you oppose it, or you can make statements about your beliefs on abortion, on reproductive freedom issues. You can say any of those things you want. You can endorse a bill or oppose a bill. We actually endorse lots of bills, so you can take a position on a piece of legislation. You can speak to your members of Congress. You can speak before a legislature, whether it's, you know, Congress or a state legislature. You can testify. You can write them letters about your positions on issues. You just can't endorse when you're doing that. And then if you're thinking about, okay, I've got it, I know I can do political issues and I can take a stance on an issue, what can I do around the election? So you can do nonpartisan work around an election. You can do get out the vote stuff. You can encourage your members to vote. You can have voter registration drives. You can organize rides to the polls on election day. You just have to be nonpartisan, and you can't say you can get on the bus if you are going to vote for this person or that person, or, get on the bus, I sure hope you vote for this person. You just can't do that. You can have candidate forums, but you have to invite all the candidates to your forum. You can't say there's a candidate forum and it just happens to be the candidate that I really like and no one else is invited. So you have to invite them all. And you can do, a really tricky issue is around questionnaires. You can do questionnaires, but if you want to do something like that, you should seek additional counsel, because if they are done, we criticize some of our opponents frequently because they would have, questionnaires, but it would be very clear that like the answer was supposed to be a certain answer, and then one person would get 100 and one person would get 0, and it was very clear that like 100 was your position. That is the same as endorsing a candidate. So you just need to be a little careful around things like that.
That's really helpful, Maggie. Thank you.
Oh, and actually, before I just want to say that you don't have to memorize all of that. We have a do's and don'ts document, and Sabrina just put it in the chat form. I swear, Sabrina, I was going to remember to say it. So you can go there and check that out, and it will tell you a lot of these things. It should be really helpful. It's on our Project Fair Play resource page.
Okay, thank you. Always great resources from Americans United. So I think maybe I want to take us all to a doomsday scenario. What's at stake if we don't protect the Johnson Amendment? I know we were down to a wire, but that doesn't mean that efforts won't be made again to repeal the Johnson Amendment. So Judge Griffin, maybe if we can hear from you, since you are on both sides in some sense, as a judge as well as a pastor. What happens if we don't protect the Johnson Amendment?
Rabbi Barr mentioned one of them earlier, the notion of dark money. If you don't protect the Johnson Amendment, then let's assume that there is this force, your favorite or your nemesis, that wants to dump a whole bunch of money into a congregation. And then because houses of worship are not audited, our donations are not monitored, then houses of worship literally become treasure chests of dark money, where all the forces of partisanship funnel their money through there. And that's the first thing. If you thought that Citizens United was opening the door to a whole bunch of adverse reactions, then imagine Citizens United with a sectarian flavor on it. That's the first problem. The second problem is, when does the house of worship begin to speak with the voice of faith clarity as opposed to fund clarity? When are we the conscience as opposed to simply being a commercial brand, another voice that is commercialized. I think those are the two big problems for me.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I have one question for you, Rabbi Bar, in terms of, and you touched upon it a little bit, but maybe you can explore a little bit more in maybe what you have seen locally in terms of the importance of the Johnson Amendment to religious minorities. What impact is there on us? What protections are there as a result of it? And what impact could there be if there were any changes to it?
I see the Johnson Amendment as one more bulwark in assuring separation of church and state. And if that's eroded and there is a dominant religious voice that is being well funded, those of us in religious minorities are going to find ourselves more on the fringes of American society. I think one of the responsibilities of religious institutions is to ensure the health of America. And ensuring the health of America means that everyone feels part and parcel of the American experience. Now, there are some people who don't want that anymore. They want to articulate a, I think, mythic history of America, trying to make a claim that it was a religious country versus a secular country. And we, as religious leaders, need to remind people that, no, this was designed as a secular country. There is no religious test to be a member of our government. And I think the Johnson Amendment is something that we can hold onto right now and push, because so many things are being eroded. But I fear for the religious minorities. I fear for that our voices aren't going to be heard, that our value sets aren't going to be part of the public square, because the voices of religious groups that are well-funded and are larger will dominate. And we're going to find ourselves sitting on the sidelines with little voice and feeling very, very marginalized. And I think that's not only unhealthy for those religious groups, I think it's unhealthy for America. My concern about what's America going to look like in the future if separation of church and state continues to erode, and a narrow, and this is the other issue, it's a narrow interpretation of religion. I hear almost every group, whether it's Christianity or Judaism or Islam, there's a range of beliefs within each of those groups as well. And we need to recognize that the separation of church and state is healthy. I happen to be a liberal Jewish leader, and there are religious leaders, Jewish leaders who don't like my voice, but it's an equal, and I think we're going to lose that.
No, great points. I have one last question before we turn to the audience questions. So I want to shift our gaze just a little bit. And, you know, we've talked a lot about the responsibility of faith leaders, of houses of worship, in helping ensure the separation of church and state, and also to ensure that we're in compliance with the Johnson Amendment. But what is the responsibility of those running for public office? Surely they are constrained by the same constitution that we are. What do you see as their responsibility? And I'll turn it to all three of you, and I'll just give you an example before doing that. So we know that the Trump-Pence campaign has made promises specific to evangelicals. The Biden-Harris campaign has released a handful of faith-based agenda for some, but not all communities. There is a Muslim community agenda, a Jewish American agenda. I believe there's a Catholic American agenda. So what are your thoughts on the faith-based outreach that has clearly kind of become part of election season, and these faith-based legislative promises, and what responsibilities political candidates have towards faith communities? We can start with maybe Maggie, and then Judge Griffin, and then Rabbi Bar.
Sure, I have two thoughts on that. One, and I won't talk about which campaign is doing this, but one campaign is flouting the Johnson Amendment, going to houses of worship, having big events, big gatherings. And to me, I think that is both really problematic, because I think it's just morally wrong to be violating the Johnson Amendment like that. But they're also putting these houses of worship at risk, right? Like maybe the current administration isn't going to enforce the Johnson Amendment robustly, but they are putting these houses of worship, they are asking them to break the law and telling them that it's fine and putting their tax exempt status on the line. I think that's a huge problem. As far as the outreach, I mean, I've never worked on a campaign, but I do think that they're trying to find the line between recognizing that there are people of faith and recognizing, that they want to speak to them, but at the same time, it's sort of, like religious displays, right? Like you can't decide to have a few groups because you're gonna leave people out. And then the message that it sends to everyone else who doesn't fit in one of the boxes they created is that they're not welcome and they're not recognized. And so I think there's a huge danger in that.
No, thank you. Judge Griffin.
One of the things that I think we have to be careful about is that there are people now who would love to be able to get religious institutions to be able to fund their political campaigns. I mean, that is actually a reality. There are people at work, and I won't say on which side of the divide they are on, but this is, and I'm not talking about something I've dreamt up in a altered state of consciousness. This is something happening in real time in 2020 now. And this is a threat to religious freedom of everyone. It is especially a threat to religious freedom of minority faith, minority organizations. It's a threat to tax exempt status. It's also, and I'll put on my pastoral hat, it also is a defining line for who really knows how to be a caring leader for a congregation and who doesn't. I'm a parent. I love everybody, but everybody can't come into my house. And if you don't wash your hands, if you don't practice sanitation, you just can't come in my house. And if you don't observe the Johnson Amendment, you cannot come into our house of worship. It pollutes the faith. We have got to have pastors who are going to be guardians, rabbis, imams, faith leaders, and faithful people who say to the politicians, yes, I can work on your campaign if I'm an individual, but our congregation doesn't. We are not for sale. By the way, you cannot outsource your campaign through our congregation.
Yeah, strong words. Rabbi Barr?
So I absolutely agree about outsourcing congregations that way. I think that Judge Griffin is absolutely right. I also had the unique opportunity that I was running for the US Congress. I was only the third rabbi in the history of the United States of America to do so, and did step out during a primary for a variety of reasons, but was in for a number of months in running. And it was very interesting being a candidate and being a rabbi simultaneously. One, I worked with the attorneys that I knew to make sure that I didn't violate the separation of church and state. And it was interesting to see friends of mine, clergy, who were reaching out to me and making sure that the lines were very clear. And I think the problem with some of this faith-based work that campaigns are doing, it's inauthentic. They are trying to use avenues to say, look at how moral, look at how religious, or look at our positions. I think the candidates have a responsibility to actually be who they are, and campaigns need to do that as well. It should be about authenticity, not trying to usurp or use institutions. So when I was running, I was still speaking in churches and synagogues and mosques as a rabbi, but not as a candidate. And it was really clear that I never stood up in that role, but they would invite me in because I've been teaching for years and years in churches. And I think we should demand from all those campaigns a sense of, who are you really? Show us your authenticity, show us your values. And the other thing that needs to be stressed as well is there is a large segment of the American population for whom religious institutions don't speak for them. And their voices and their needs and their attitudes have to be respected. And reaching those groups are a little bit more difficult because they are not as well organized. They're using the religious institutions or cultural institutions because there's an organizational structure. But I fear that the voice of the and it's a terrible term, we use the word non-religious, people whose belief structure doesn't fit into this organized pre-existing structure aren't being heard and aren't being respected near enough. And we need to push on that as well as religious leaders to make sure that those people aren't lost because they're fully American as well. And their voices need to be heard. In fact, they're the largest growing group in America right now.
A very, very appropriate advice. I'm going to now turn to some of the questions that we've gotten from our audience, and I will try my best to, assign them to the right person, although I know all of you would have something brilliant to say about them. So here's one question. Originally, it was religious leaders in the colonies who wanted separation from state because they said that the government did not know how to practice religion, therefore should keep hands off. It seems that separation now is held by the left. Are there evangelicals who espouse separation of church state, and do you ever engage them in dialogue? Maybe Maggie, I know that we have a huge coalition that you're able to pull together, and it's very diverse. So if you could weigh in on that.
So it's actually a really interesting question. There are, individual evangelicals, right? Like our former faith outreach person was an evangelical. So there are many evangelicals who I think are in our position. And actually the Evangelical Association did a poll of their members, and their members, it was a vast majority said they don't want their preachers to endorse candidates from the pulpit. But one thing that might surprise all of you is that when Americans United was started, we were started by members of the Southern Baptists and the Evangelicals, the Seventh-day Adventists, and a bunch of other organizations like that, and they wanted church-state separation. And this would be an entire other webinar, but things started to happen, including, desegregation of schools in the South. And what did they want? They wanted money so that they could put money into private white Christian schools and have school vouchers. And that is when things really turned. So that is a huge moment in the world of church-state separation. But that doesn't speak for everyone. That speaks for certain groups who are on the opposite side of us today. But I do think that there are a lot of evangelicals who think this. And the Johnson Amendment Coalition we created to support the Johnson Amendment was amazing when it came to faith voices. Maybe actually I can put in the chat too, maybe our link to that page that shows the organizations that are on our side.
Thank you, Maggie. And I think it's important you bring out the fact that, just because we say here's one faith community and here's the bucket, and certainly we're seeing the campaigns doing that they're never a monolith. There's going to be internal diversity within all of these communities. And it's in some sense an opportunity for people who may have very serious theological differences to be able to come together on principle, that principle being the separation of church and state, to be able to work together, knowing that eventually or the final goal is to protect religion. So here's another question, and I think I will ask both Rabbi Barr as well as Judge Griffin, because you both have congregations. The lines of the Johnson Amendment have seemed fuzzy to me. Does calling out the administration's, quote, the administration's policies is unjust and asking for a change in administration, end quote, violate the Johnson Amendment? Can you criticize a politician's policy from the pulpit outside of election season? And if so, how is election season defined?
I preach from the pulpit and I criticize xenophobia and hostility to immigrants. I preach from the pulpit and I preach that it is hateful, it is unloving, it is unjust, and a violation of our faith to oppress people who are LGBTQI. I preach from the faith and say that the leader of our faith had a health care plan that treated folks with pre-existing conditions without a copay. And therefore, the idea that you would abolish a health care plan that covers pre-existing conditions, it violates my faith. Mm-hmm. And I say that anybody who says that this is just and loving doesn't know what our faith stands for. And our congregation knows that that's true whether the person is one label or the other label. And I'm also known and said, I will tell the person, your favorite candidate, that if you want me to. But I'll go to their office and tell them. They can come to church and hear me tell them. I just will not go and stand in a campaign rally for them as your pastor and say it. Now, I may stand in a campaign rally as myself and say to them, you know, your policies are criminally wrong. But I will not put New Millennium Church on that. That's Wendell Griffin and my faith position as an individual. It is not the position of the congregation.
Thanks. Rabbi Barr?
I hope that over the course of my tenure at my congregation, I've been saying these things irrespective of the season. I talk about, as Jen Griffin was speaking about, a certain set of values. I talk about them all the time, whether it's about, including the stranger. There's a whole text in the Bible about, the stranger at our gate, making sure that they feel included, leaving the corners of the field for the hungry, talking about equal rights and justice. Those are values that I articulate all the time, irrespective of whether there's an election or not an election. So I think my members and those who come to our community know what I stand for and represent. I think the challenge is that during election season, which is typically defined by when the ads start, I'm talking about the heat of the election seasons, occasionally people will hear our words and infer from them things that were not intended. I had somebody say, well, and this was a number of years ago when President Obama was running, and they said, I used the word hope in my sermon, and that was meant to be a cue to all the people in the congregation. And I just happened to read at the same time that at the Republican convention that they used the word hope more than the Democratic convention. So I said, so maybe I'm really a Republican. I said, I was using the word hope. That's a religious word. And the problem often isn't, it's not the clergy. We're oftentimes just doing our job. People hear our words and think, oh, you're trying to send a secret message. I don't send secret messages. I send clarity, I hope, about the values we hold. The intensity, however, of partisanship is infecting so many aspects. And one of my responsibilities is to try to keep it outside the doors of our community, because we need a place where there's civility. We need a place where people disagree and can have serious intellectual conversations about our differences and how do we resolve them. Because we need ultimately, not only within our congregations, but in our nation to have a forum and a format to resolve the major critical issues that are in front of us right now. Massive climate change, talking about science as something and data that we can all rely on becomes more and more important. So it's not only what we say in the congregation, but it's a set of skills that I want to bring into the non-religious, into the wider community as well, about how do we have good conversations based upon our values without demeaning or demonizing the other.
Thanks. This next question, I'm just going to maybe have you raise your hand if it's one that you're able to answer. But what if a church harasses or excommunicates someone for not holding the political views of the church, or I would assume the leader? Is that legal or is it ethical? Anyone want to take that?
Well, I don't think it's ethical.
Mhm.
As a pastor, as a religious leader, I don't think it's ethical, but each congregation basically is the arbiter of its own community. And government doesn't get into that. It's a strong line, you know, as a lawyer, it's a strong line of case law. Government does not adjudicate doctrinal
Right.
or religious or theological disputes. No, how you baptize or whether you baptize, whether or not you do this, that, or a third in your particular tradition is none of government's business. And that's part of the separation of church and state that we hold dear. The government should not be in part of that. I hope that answers your question.
No, I think so. I think so. This next, I'm going to kind of combine this question. And Maggie, let me ask you, how imminent is the threat to the Johnson Amendment? And is the Johnson Amendment being fully enforced? So is there a policing mechanism, or is this all, you know, Scouts honor, pinky promise type stuff?
So as far as how imminent the threat is, again, we were like on the cusp of losing it in 2018. Now that there is a divided House and Senate, there was much less of a threat in that it wasn't going to pass through. It wasn't going to pass through the House. The House had made very clear that they weren't going to deal with that. So they can sometimes sneak things in very creative ways, and so we have to remain vigilant. There are always bills out there. There's attempts to, you know, sneak into funding bills that they can't spend any money on the IRS enforcing it. There's lots of complicated ways that Congress can work with that. As far as what the administration is doing, the president has said that he has gotten rid of the Johnson Amendment. He can't do that. It's a statutory provision. He signed an executive order. It didn't do what he said that it did, so it still exists. The vice president has been a little bit more honest, he's been a little bit more clear about what he means by that, which is that they're not enforcing the Johnson Amendment. So they haven't been enforcing the Johnson Amendment. They've told the IRS essentially not to enforce it. Again, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't adhere to it just because they're not enforcing it. But they're not really pushing it. And so we have, in our world, we used to actually turn organizations into the IRS and say, you know, it's really obvious they just violated this IRS. Why don't you go check this out? And then we sort of pivoted when the Johnson Amendment was really at risk. We prioritized that work in Congress over reporting people, right? Like we wanted to be like, actually, this is good for everyone. Let's focus on Congress. And so at the moment, we have not been turning people in because they're not enforcing it. But I do think that there can be a pivot depending on what happens with the election and where people stand. You know, that will sort of indicate where we go next as far as defending the Johnson Amendment.
Thanks, Maggie. Here's a question for, I think, both Rabbi Barr as well as Judge Griffin. Political strategists know that greatly religious people, especially evangelicals, make good voters who put their unwavering faith in a candidate or party, have high confirmation bias, and will go to great lengths to get their candidate elected. How can religion prevent their congregations from being harvested or brainwashed by political super PAC groups? And I'll even extend this question, but in terms of even news sources and things that kind of skirt on a lot of these issues, or their news stories that then political candidates pick up on, what are you doing in terms of, I guess, shepherding your congregations in terms of how to take in everything? Is there a role for religious leaders to do that? Rabbi Barr?
Okay. It's a very interesting question. I think it's a nuanced question too, in that I think some of the religious groups that, that these political campaigns are relying on are already inclined to do that. They've already been set up, and it's been going on for quite a long time. We're witnessing the results of 40 or 50 years, going back to really when there were groups that were beginning to work this side of the street, if you will. I think the challenge now is to teach our children as well as our adults how to consume information. We are living at a time where there is massive amounts of information, and they're going to have to distinguish between accurate information and reliable information and to assess the source. And frankly, we're beginning to do that in our religious school with our kids because they have access to the world. You think right now too with COVID, how many kids are working online? And for them, the idea of doing research isn't going to a library, it's going to Google or going to some other search engine. And we have a responsibility, I think, to teach critical thinking skills, analytic skills, how to determine the difference between a myth that we may enjoy as part of our religious tradition and historical fact. And that becomes an educational device that's important. There's some religions that don't want to do that. And that is the reality that we face. And we see it certainly within sort of the conservative or the more traditional Orthodox side within the Jewish community.
Judge Griffin, did you want to add anything?
I agree with Rabbi Barr. We're in the silly season. I said it to our congregation just last week. I have begun a series of sermons aimed at faith in the silly season because the idea is that there is a lot of pandering going on under the guise of principle.
Mm-hmm.
And we who are people of faith have to be discerning enough to recognize the difference between pandering and principle. And we have to then be prophetic enough to call it what it is. It's not holy, it's hypocrisy. And for us, we have a responsibility to say, you don't bring your hypocrisy in this, okay? Practice hypocrisy out in your area. If hypocrisy is what you are trafficking, there's a place for you to do it, okay? It's called Wall Street, it's called Park Avenue, it's called ad campaigns. But this is not where we are. We're about trying to deal with truth, and we're a place of faith for all persons. We're trying to build community. And we're trying to model what community looks like for people who are from every walk and nation and language and creed and call. And so I think those of us who are in the faith business have to be proactive. I get the mail because, I'm Baptist, and I get the mail from Focus on the Family and the usual suspects, okay? And I've gotten their voter, they said, okay, send out we'll send you your voter guide. And I tell the church administrator, the trash mail is building up now. And the congregation knows, yes, the trash mail is building out. There will not be a voter guide. Don't ask me to give you a voter guide. I will not give you a voter guide. I will tell you, you have an obligation to vote intelligently. And I hope that you will have enough faith, awareness to know that you should vote in a way that is truthful and fair for all persons. But if you are asking me to tell you which candidate to vote for as your pastor, excuse me, you have not met that guy in me.
Thank you. We've had such a wonderful conversation here, and I know we could go on for at least another half hour, 45 minutes, but we are coming up on time. I want to give all of our panelists at least 45 seconds to give closing remarks, and then I will pass it off back to Sabrina. How about Maggie, if you'd like to give any closing remark, closing thoughts?
Sure. So, I think everyone has really said this, that the Johnson Amendment is about protecting the integrity of our houses of worship and protecting the integrity of our nonprofit organizations. One point I just want to say real quick is one example that really spoke to me when I was working with the nonprofit groups is they were saying, what happens if you get rid of the Johnson Amendment and then our social service programs become Republican and Democrat, right? Like what happens if there's suddenly the Republican soup kitchen and then there's the Democratic soup kitchen, and then whoever gives the most money to that candidate then gets funded to do those services. That is not the kind of world we want to live in, whether it is by churches or by a secular organization. And I think those are the sorts of dangers that we also need to think about.
Thanks. Rabbi Barr?
So I appreciate that this forum and being with all of you to share this. I think that maintaining the separation of church and state is about maintaining the integrity of America. It protects the religious institutions and it protects our government as well. When people use religion to sort of make themselves look holy or make themselves look like they are more moral, I think it's a misuse of religion and it's unhealthy for the American body politic. I'm hopeful that what we can do is ensure that separation, maintain it, and we have to rebuild it, frankly, because it is eroded so much, so that the society that we live in is inclusive of all people, of religious faith and those with other faith, with minority faith, those who don't have religious faith, that everyone feels part and parcel of this incredible tapestry. What's at risk is losing something that was an experiment that was so bizarre when we broke and revolted from England. And we still have to work to maintain what our founders built for us. And that's our responsibility right now.
Thank you, Rabbi Barr. And Judge Griffin.
We're in this pandemic experience, and I draw on a pandemic example. The Johnson Amendment is the vaccine against sectarianism in our society. So we are not a theocracy. We are not a theocracy, we're a democracy. It is the government of the masses. And everybody in this society should benefit from this vaccine. We wouldn't throw away a vaccine for polio. We wouldn't think of it. Nor would we tell people, listen, we want you to give us a watered down version of it. We would want to make sure that vaccine's kept alive. The Johnson Amendment is our vaccine. Let's keep it going, and let's keep inoculating people with it.
I love that. I don't think I'll ever think of the Johnson Amendment in any different way, except in a syringe with a sharp end. Sabrina, thank you for this, and I'm handing it over back to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Suhag, for serving as our moderator and moving this discussion forward. I want to thank you to all of our panelists, Judge Wendell Griffin, Rabbi Robert Barr, and Maggie Garrett of Americans United. I just want to thank all of you for being a part of this very important conversation. And I encourage you to please take a look at the website, projectfairplay.org /resources, so you can know the do's and don'ts of having these discussions in your houses of worship. But again, it's important that we exercise our civic rights, but at the same time, know where we should not overstep the boundaries. So again, thank you for joining us for today's conversation. It will be available for those that want to share it with your communities. And I hope that you have a good rest of the day. Thank you, everyone.